Live.
Alex, I'll let you do the admin because it's just asking folks to do the Q&A panel and then whatever else you want to say. But I'll just go
Okay.
on mute in the background and I'll paste questions that come in from Zoom and I'll try to do that on YouTube as well in the doc. And then I'll try to, if folks ask questions in the chat, I'll just ask them to post in the Q&A channel. And then whenever you guys bring up a link, I'll try to make sure I get that into the chat as well.
We are live on YouTube and we are
Sweet.
now live on Zoom as well. Good afternoon, good morning, time appropriate greetings, everybody. Welcome into another Tailscale live stream here with me, Alex, and I'm also joined today by Jay, who's one of our solutions engineers. Hi, Jay.
Hello, Alex. And also will be popping up every now and then is Polyester, who is sitting in her cat bed right next to me.
Polyester, that's a fun name. So the general way this works, we have a bunch of questions that come in the live stream. We have some pre-staged questions in the Zoom chat. I also keep half an eye on the YouTube chat as well. So feel free to drop a question in either place, and Jay and I will do our absolute best to get to all of the questions in the next hour or so. Standard rules apply, of course. Please be civil. Please keep things on topic, that kind of thing. And all right. I think with that, we can probably make a start. How was your Thanksgiving weekend, Jay?
So I'm in Canada, but I did travel across the border to get second Thanksgiving in, as we call American Thanksgiving, when we live close enough to commute. I had a turducken, which might have been the most American thing I've ever eaten. It was quite nice.
Okay,
And
what's a turducken? That's
it
new
is
on
a
me.
turkey that's been stuffed with a chicken that's been stuffed with a duck. And it was smoked on my father-in-law's Traeger, and it is a unusual bit of meat, but uh, one thing I do appreciate living so close to the United States is Americans are almost universally, in my experience, very good at preparing meat.
Yes, that's true. My particular meat preparation of choice, I think, goes to the people who live in or around Austin. But yes.
Yes.
Um, so this is the first time I think you've been on one of these webinars.
Second.
Second time. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, for those that aren't familiar with who you are, Jay, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Jay Stapleton. I'm a solutions engineer here at Tailscale, and I've been with the company now for just over 3 years. Past 3 years last week, and I've been working mostly lately in our pre-sales organization, where I help generally larger enterprise customers or larger commercial customers as they're getting set up to work out things like best practices around ACLs, around architecture, that sort of thing. I live in Windsor, Ontario, which is in the southernmost bit of Canada.
That is basically Detroit, isn't it?
Yeah, we're right across the river from Detroit. It's about the same distance for me to go to downtown Windsor as downtown Detroit. There's about a 10-minute difference.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Well, why don't we jump into the Tailscale questions? There's a few pre-staged in the YouTube live chat already. So the way this works, typically I'll read out a question, or Jay, if you see one in the YouTube chat that you like the look of, or Zoom, you can sort of ping it my way too, and we'll kind of ping back and forth with the Q&A. We might not know the answers. In fact, it's highly likely we don't know all the answers. So if we don't, and you want to follow up with us, you can reach out to our support teams at support@tailscale.com with any further questions you might have, or indeed, if it's a bit more complicated, sales@tailscale.com too is where you can go. So Mark writes in with the first question: is there any news on being able to use tail drop between tagged devices and devices owned by other users on the same tailnet?
Uh, so yes and no. Tail drop has not gotten a great deal of attention lately. But we do have a newer feature in alpha right now called Tail Drive. That's going to be a lot more robust way of transferring files between devices on your tailnet. And this is basically a full-blown web dev server, and the permissions can be set in your ACLs using the grants that were introduced last year. And I think somebody has already dropped a link to the docs on Tail Drive in the chat there. But Tail Drive sort of picks up where Tail Drop left off. I still use Tail Drop very often to throw things onto my phone from my workstation, but I now have Tail Drive set up for all of my infrastructure devices, my VPSs, everything else in my home lab, so I can move things around in a more robust way, I guess.
So tail drive is going to be pretty interesting. You configure it through your ACLs. In fact, the K-base article linked in the various chats is probably the best overall explanation of what it is and does. But essentially, it allows you to use the storage on the devices that are connected to your tailnet as kind of like a Google Drive, like a Dropbox style situation, but it makes it available to any other device on your tailnet using WebDAV, like Jay said. So it's a pretty interesting technology. And I think actually, if I can touch on another part of the question, which is talking about sort of tag devices and devices owned by other users, that's a complicated kettle of fish, because when you are authenticating devices to your tailnet, you are authenticating them in a couple of ways. Typically, you will do it manually, and you'll log in as a specific user to the Tailscale admin console, and then do a Tailscale up and add the devices to your tailnet that way. And at which point they become authenticated and kind of owned by you, right? Whereas if you use something like an auth key, again, the user that generates that auth key owns the device that gets authenticated with that auth key. If you, however, decide to use something like an OAuth client, you have to use tags, because OAuth clients have no inherent identity contained within them, at least within the Tailscale identity structures. So the downside of that approach of being very granular with identity is that if you are trying to share things around, it becomes a question of ownership, and becomes this messy melange of stuff that you just can't quite reconcile without some really funky business going on underneath, unfortunately. So to actually answer the question directly, no, there is no news on tail drops specifically with tag devices and devices owned by other users, for the reasons I just mentioned. But if you have any other questions on identity, I'm sure myself or Jay would love to take them.
Yeah. And for those who are relatively new to the concept of tag devices, I encourage that a lot with the customers I deal with daily, because these are generally, they're commercial deployments, and you don't necessarily want the user that's responsible for spinning up all of your app connectors and exit nodes and whatnot to be tied to those devices, because uh, it will inherit those permissions. So applying the tag gives it their own identity that you can manage separately without needing to use service accounts. And it also means that, if Alex spins up all of our infrastructure and then goes off and wins the lottery, when his account is removed after he's retired off to a warm island somewhere, those tagged devices will just keep on trucking. They won't disappear with the account.
I think I'll just move to Manitoulin Island and just, go freeze my freeze myself to death instead.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a great point, Jay. Thanks for raising that. Now, there's a quick question here from, and I'm going to butcher this name in advance. I am incredibly sorry, but Przemysław Niznalski. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. If the entire Tailscale infrastructure is taken over by a hacker, will they have access to private networks between user devices?
So there's a little bit of depth there. One, I'd say no, because your private keys never leave your device. That gives you inherent security. What Tailscale does manage in in our infrastructure are things like the device membership on your tailnet and your ACLs. So there is a threat model there where uh, somebody who has owned Tailscale may be able to add a device to your tailnet. And what we've done for people who have that as part of their threat model is we have a feature called Tailnet Lock that prevents a device from being able to communicate with any other node on your network without being cryptographically countersigned by one of your trusted nodes. So this is not frequently used outside of home lab users who like to do it because it's fun to play with, and that's why I've done it.
And they're owners of aluminium-based foil headwear.
Yes. But it has come up a couple of times with customers in very high compliance industries, where this was considered by their auditors to be a necessary part of their deployment.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought Telnet Lock up, actually. That was going to be the route I was going to take with this answer too. The other thing to consider as well is that the Tailscale infrastructure is actually very minimal. So there isn't a huge attack surface, if you like. And with the private keys themselves never leaving the device, like Jay says, again, it just reduces a huge number of vectors because let's say, hypothetically, and I don't even know if this is technically possible, but let's say someone runs amok on one of the control servers and has access to everything. I don't know how that would happen, but let's just presuppose in a worst case dystopian scenario that happens. What do they have access to? Not a whole bunch, honestly. They might have, a list of IPs here or there of which node lives where and some routing tables, but everything's encrypted at rest in Tailscale land anyway.
Mhm.
So, you'd have to be pretty switched on to get into the box in the first place and then figure out what's going on. And even then, once you've done that, because you don't have the private keys and because of how PKI encryption works, there's not much you can do besides adding new nodes potentially to get around that. And then if, like Jay says, if that's a part of your threat model, Tailnet Lock absolutely solves for that issue, in totality. So
I think one of the conversations that was had very early on when architecting Tailscale was let's remove us from that circle of trust as much as we can practically do while still making the product very easy to use for people in general.
and in that same vein, we don't host usernames and passwords. That's one of the reasons we have OAuth for everything. The Google, Apple, Microsoft list of what are they called? OIDC providers. Sorry, not
Mhm.
OAuth. And we're not interested in user data. That's not part of Tailscale's business model. It's not part of, we want to remain GDPR compliant, and we do that very, very simply. We don't have any user data to speak of. So it makes our life easier in a lot of ways too.
We had a question come in through the Q&A panel about having a wireless network where all clients are connected to the internet via Tailscale exit node. Uh, and Mike Ruttenberg says that he will likely use a Raspberry Pi for this. I have done something similar with a little travel router, the GliNet or GLINet
Yeah.
travel router that has that feature built in. Doing it through Raspberry Pi. I won't go into too much depth because you're going to have to draw the rest of the owl yourself, but you will need to basically have that Raspberry Pi being the gateway to the internet for that network, and then have it connecting to the exit node. So you'll have to do some manual routing there to tell, probably via DHCP, all of the devices on that network that their default route goes out through the LAN IP of the Raspberry Pi. And then from there, make sure you have IP forwarding turned on, and Tailscale will handle that sort of last hop of the routing to the exit node.
Can you do it with a Raspberry Pi? Yes. In the words of Jeff Goldblum, should you? Not sure. I mean, if you want to do it purely as an academic exercise, it could be a fun way to learn about DNS mask and IP routing and all that kind of stuff. But the easy button for this is just to get something that's already designed to be a router, like the GLINet stuff that Jay recommended that's running. I think it's OpenWRT under the covers, even though it's got a skin on top of it. I think it's just OpenWRT underneath. It runs Tailscale natively. Those devices run Tailscale natively, and you don't have to worry about managing a whole bunch of stuff that you would have to build yourself if you were try to bootstrap a Linux distro to basically be a firewall, which is what you're trying to create at that point.
Yeah, and I have done this sort of thing with a Raspberry Pi Nano W before, and again, strictly as a I wonder if this will work. And it is, let's just say the regular Tailscale experience is magical and everything just works. And when you start getting into these real bespoke, you know, academic exercises, it becomes less magical and more of, can I shoehorn this in? And yes, you can. We behave as a layer three router would be expected to behave. It's
Yes,
just
this is not part of the wizarding world, unfortunately. So I don't know what your knowledge of Active Directory is like, but we have a question on the YouTube side from Dan Foxley talking about Tailscale and Magic DNS, and he says he'd like to replace their corporate VPN with Tailscale.
Mhm.
Currently, our network is a Microsoft Active Directory network, and I don't think Magic DNS has the features that we need. I'd love to get some feedback on the Microsoft Active Directory and Tailscale integrations in regards to DNS specifically.
Yeah, what I've done most commonly, I should say there are some steps you can take to make Tailscale work on an AD server directly. But it is not, there's some friction between those two things. So my normal recommendation is to use a subnet router to access your Active Directory server itself. Uh, AD servers have specific requirements about what they call multi-homing and having networks, especially with DNS on them, that they don't control themselves. So that's the source of the friction. And there are some people on GitHub and on Stack Exchange that have posted recipes that they've done to get AD working with Tailscale directly installed on the server. Uh, I tend to just say, let's use a subnet router for that because once again, we're looking for the magic, right? We want something that works uh, pretty much out of the box. Um, and once you have that AD server that is accessible via the subnet router, you can set that as your DNS server in the Tailscale admin console. So rather than using Magic DNS for everything, you can use the Magic DNS names for the devices that are specifically connected to Tailscale and use your AD DNS server for everything else. The nice thing about that is you may not need to make any changes if those resources are behind a subnet router because they'll be on the same IP address as if you were in the LAN.
It's nice that Tailscale just runs on multiple operating systems. And when we say it runs on Windows, that includes anything from a consumer-based version right the way up to Windows Server. In a fully unattended mode as a service, of course, as well, you can install it as a service on Windows and just treat it like any other Tailscale node at that point. And then that includes access to Active Directory underneath over the tailnet, of course, and a bunch of other stuff too. Anything else to add on Active Directory whilst we're there?
No, I think that, it's a fairly common use case. We have, many customers who are using Tailscale to access Active Directory servers. The only real caveat that I've run into is if you are provisioning laptops and shipping them out to users before they've logged in for the first time, and you're expecting them to be able to log in to an AD server to get the local credentials on that laptop, there's going to be a couple of extra steps. But if you're in that position, talk to one of our sales team. They'll put you in touch with me or somebody from my team, and we can step you through how to do that.
Sounds like a proper chicken and egg type scenario.
Yes. Exactly. You need to log into the machine to have your credentials, but you need the credentials to log into the machine.
Indeed. So the solution to that, of course, is just a sticky post-it note on the inside of the laptop with the password written on it in clear text, right?
Yeah, that's the sneakernet password managers.
Yeah, I literally have started at places on day one, and there's been a laptop sat on my desk waiting for me with a sticky post-it note on the inside. So
I
I joke, but it's honestly it's a reality in some places.
bet the red teamers love that.
All right, so this is a question from Christopher Whipple again on YouTube. If I've got macOS apps that I never want to use the tailnet, for example, video conferencing or cloud backup applications, how do I ensure that they only ever use the local network connection and don't route all of their traffic over the tailnet?
Um, so I am aware of macOS having exclusions for applications. I've never done it, so I don't know if it works with Tailscale. And I don't know, Alex, if you've ever tried this, but this might be one of those questions we'll have to get back to you on.
Well, actually, I think it's making an assumption about Tailscale that's mildly inaccurate. By default, not all of the traffic goes over Tailscale, first of all. So the only routes that we publish to your Tailnet clients, to your Tailnet nodes, are the ones that are explicitly defined as subnet routes advertised by other nodes elsewhere, or indeed the 100 CG NAT space for all of your other Tailscale nodes too, of course. So the public internet isn't affected if you just have a plain Tailscale installation on macOS with just a couple of nodes in your Tailnet and nothing fancy. Everything's just going out over the public internet, and the routing tables remain completely unchanged.
Mhm.
There's only a couple of scenarios where that would actually change. One is, like I say, if you have a subnet router somewhere else, and then you publish a different CIDR range, like a 192.168 dot whatever, you publish that range to your tailnet. Tailscale will then push those subnet ranges down to each client. The traffic for each of those subnets will then go, of course, traverse the tailnet and find out whatever the shortest number of hops is to make a direct connection. The other option is if you have an exit node configured, that is more analogous to what a typical sort of privacy VPN is doing, where it sort of does a slash 0.0 slash 0, all traffic will route through Mulvad, for example. In that case, you could probably experiment with something we have called app connectors if you know of a few different things you want to whitelist to go out over a different exit point, for example. Think of it like split tunneling a little bit is what app connectors really probably should have called split tunneling, but whatever. So those are really the scenarios, Christopher, and I hope that helps you kind of understand a little bit more about how Tailscale is managing traffic. By default, as I say, it's not touching anything unless you tell it to.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying on that. Uh, we saw another question coming through from Yure Lopez on the Q&A board. Uh, is it possible to get devices listed not by name of the person who registered it? So this is talking about in the GUI of macOS or Windows. Uh, you will get a list of network devices, and those are sorted uh, by who is logged into them. Couple of things to note about this list is only devices on your netmap will be on that list. And a device is on your netmap if you have permission to connect to it or it has permission to connect to you. So once you've started building out uh, your ACLs and restricting and segmenting your network, that list of devices is going to shrink. So if you are looking to use that list sort of as a directory of where you're hosting services, I would argue that anything that is meant to be a shared service ought to be carrying a tag rather than be associated with a user at all, in which case it will all show up under the tagged devices. Um, and if you are looking to sort of build that into a more uh, more in-depth source of truth for uh, a dashboard or something, you can pull that list via the API and parse it like that.
So is it fair to think of tags like service accounts in your tailnet?
Yeah, I often refer to them as sort of a alternative to service accounts. So you don't have to have an extra Okta or Google or Microsoft account specifically for infrastructure devices, because the two identity models in Tailscale are either it is owned by a user and inherits all of those users' permissions, or it's owned by the tailnet and it's referenced by a tag. And by applying a tag to a device, you remove that association with the user that created it.
Which is exactly why in the ACLs you will see tags defined as tag owners. That was such a weird thing the first time I saw that, and I was like, "What does this mean?" And it probably took me about 6 months to wrap my head around the fact that tags are service accounts, really, like they own the nodes. And that's why when you're writing ACLs, for example, you say tag can, for example, can SSH, tag dev can SSH to production. Don't know why you'd allow developers to SSH to production, but there you go. Rather than saying Alice and Bob can SSH into production too. So
Mhm.
think of tags a little bit just like another account on your tailnet that don't cost you anything.
Now, we've got another question came in through the Q&A. Is there capability to use only IPv6 addresses for Magic DNS without disabling legacy IP? Um, so we can disable IPv4 with a statement in the ACLs and use Tailscale in only IPv6, but this is specifically not what you're asking for here. You can, like, Magic DNS does register both an A record and a quad A record. So if you are manually looking up the IP address for a host, you would dig the quad A record, for instance. Um, there is no mechanism that I'm aware of to disable A records in Magic DNS. I think that, I can see
Yeah,
some
we have
scenarios.
a pretty fundamental reliance on the 100.IP space, the carrier grade NAT IP space. We have a bunch of stuff that translates overlapping subnets into, like, it's the 4 versus 6 or 4 via 6 blog post that we have. But no, I don't think we do, actually. I think perhaps that's something we should put on the feature backlog. There's another question about IPv6 in the YouTube chat as well. So when we're done with this one, Jay, we'll hop onto that question
Yeah,
next too.
I don't know too much more I can expand on this other than once again, this information is available via the API. So if you're running Bind9 or something locally as your own DNS resolver, you can pull that information via the API, parse it out, and import it into another DNS server. But once again, that's something where you're going to have to draw the rest of the owl yourself.
I actually ran across a really interesting post on Lobsters this morning called No Nat November, talking about my month without IPv4. So this was talking about trying to do an entire month of just literally only using IPv6. You can probably guess how it turned out.
Yeah, my fiber provider at home will not offer IPv6 addresses for love or money. They are just unavailable, and this is one
Yeah.
of the largest internet providers in Canada. I uh, I don't like it, but there it is.
So we do have a couple of other IPv6 questions. So I'm kind of going to group these together whilst we're on the topic.
Mhm.
Bill Hughes writes in, I'm using Tailscale as an IPv6 transition tool. We're working to move most of our infrastructure to V6. We would like to put Tailscale on an IPv6 only device, but if the device needs to reach an IPv4 endpoint, send the IPv4 traffic over our tailnet to a specific exit node that has version 4 connectivity. Is that possible?
I I don't see why not. There will be some some routing involved there. But for the most part, if the device has like an IPv4 address, as every Tailscale device does, unless you've disabled it, then it will look for a route over IPv4. And if you're using an exit node, that will be the only route available.
I think it's one of those things that you're blazing a bit of a path here. So if you want to help us figure it out and give a proper answer in the next stream, please,
Mhm.
please let us know.
Yeah,
Every
if you
time
try
I've tried to do anything with IPv6, I've ended up with another few gray hairs in the beard down here. So
if you do end up getting it working and write a blog post about it, let us know as well. We'll
yeah,
put that in our newsletter because you're probably not the only person who is running into that particular requirement.
indeed. Uh, Nilanjan also writes in a little bit about IPv6 and quadruple A records with some issues with CNAME's resolution not working on Windows and Android, and IPv6 records not working on Android if no IPv6 2000 route is present. Do you have a solution you would recommend?
Uh, for the C names, it becomes complex because this is OS dependent. But generally speaking, a lot of operating systems will try and uh, resolve the entire chain of a C name from the same server. So if you have, say, a public DNS server, say you've got a Route 53 record that is a C name to a Tailscale name, it will fail on a lot of platforms because the OS will say, okay, you know, I want marvin.jstapleton.ca, and my CNAME says it's actually known as marvin.jws.ts.net. And then it will go back to that same public resolver and say, well, give me this ts.net address, which will fail. Some operating systems or some uh, code flows will restart the DNS lookup process with whatever the CNAME returned, in which case it will work because now you're hitting the DNS record or the magic DNS record. But you can't really rely on that because it's not going to behave consistently. So if you're using a CNAME to access a Tailscale resource, you need to put an A record on that same server that points to the Tailscale IP address, which if it's public, nobody else is going to be able to reach that IP address because it's on your tailnet. But public DNS can be used for that sort of thing as well.
What's weird about that is it seems to primarily the CNAME issue specifically primarily seems to only affect Windows and Android hosts. And the weird thing about that is Windows is on its own like tree, right? That's fine. But Android is Linux. Like, and you'd
Mhm.
think it would just be so if the bug affected Android, you'd think it would affect also Linux, but I guess there must be some other shenanigans going on in the DNS stack or networking stack somewhere in regards to that.
I
But
don't think it's actually a bug. I think this is DNS servers being RFC compliant with how they're handling CNAMEs versus other platforms being a little more liberal with how they interpret the rules.
the more like guidelines anyway, right? So a quick time check. We're about halfway through the session. I see there's well over 100 of you between Zoom and YouTube watching right now. So hello, everybody. If you'd like to make sure you ask your questions before we run out of time, please go ahead and ask them. We're romping through them, so we do need a couple more to fill out the hour. Avery Chen Roth writes in, hey, Avery, it's a name I recognize from previous sessions. Is there a way to share a Tailscale device with someone without requiring them to create a tailnet? Sort of a bit like Funnel, but behind an authorization link.
So not within the Tailscale tooling. What I have done in the past for family members and such who don't have a great use case for Tailscale in their own lives, but who want to access one of my servers for whatever reason, is say just sign up with your Gmail account and I'll come over and set it up. The extra
The
step
J
that you're
install option.
Yes. The extra step that you're looking for there would probably be to, if you're using Tailscale Funnel hitting something like Nginx and using HTTP auth to require them to have a username and password at least. But this is not really part of what Tailscale's offering.
Correct. If you put it on the public internet using Tailscale Funnel, it's on the public internet using Tailscale Funnel, right? You the issue with that. So the way that Funnel works is you're basically proxying all of the traffic through a public facing endpoint that we provide for you for free. If you only use Tailscale Serve, of course, you then need to have the other client be on Tailscale in order for the routing and the key exchange and all that to work, because it's not routing through that public facing endpoint. So a couple of caveats when you think about the architecture involved there. Funnel, because it's proxying all the traffic through that cloud funnel egress point, we have some pretty strong QoS bandwidth limitations on that. Like, you're not going to be streaming video through a funnel share, for example, at least not reliably or in any great quality. Whereas if you, for example, are sharing a Jellyfin server with somebody and you want them to have access without having a Tailscale account, the best way to do that is Tailscale Serve. It's just the reality of the situation. You'll get a TLS certificate out of the box. You'll get a direct connection almost certainly. Thank you, Zoom. You'll get a direct connection out of the box as well, so that their Apple TV or whatever it is can connect directly to your Jellyfin server, wherever it is. And there's no intermediary, so you'll get the best performance you possibly can. As Jay said, it's not part of the Tailscale tooling to have some kind of an authenticated link to a Tailscale resource without involving Tailscale on the client device as well. So we've got a few more questions over on the YouTube side. Zoom people, we need you to send us a few more if you wouldn't mind. Ash writes in talking about the Sky Q box, which is basically it's like a Sky TV in the UK. Saying, does anybody have any experience accessing a Sky Q box remotely with Tailscale? I've set up an Apple TV as a subnet router, but I'm having no luck getting the Sky Go app to recognize the Sky Q box on the other end. And I suspect that's because it's trying to use MDNS to do discovery over the tailnet. Jay, do you want to talk a little bit about MDNS over tailnets?
Yeah. So Tailscale is a layer 3 router. If you're the sort of nerd that knows what the OSI stack looks like, layer 3 is where TCP IP happens. MDNS or multicast DNS or multicast in general all happens on layer 2. So things like bonjour.
Bonjour.
Yeah.
You're in the French, you're in the French speaking part of the world up there, nearly.
I should have pronounced that better. My Canadian friends are all wincing. But things like bonjour, which is Apple's implementation of MDNS and other multicast-based discovery tools, or things like if you install a printer driver on your phone and hit Find My Printer. These things use multicast. Multicast is not going to traverse the tailnet because it is happening at a lower level than we're handling. So there are some hacks out there for multicast repeaters. I think that's kind of out of the scope of anything I'd give advice on. I just know that they exist. But if you're able to manually punch in the IP address of that device, whether it is this SkyQ or a printer or whatever you're trying to discover, that will usually bypass that multicast part of the setup process, so you won't need to rely on that layer 2 sort of thing. And please, no questions that are any further in depth on the OSI model there, because that's the extent of it that I keep up here.
Well, it's worth noting that Avahi and as well as Bonjour and a bunch of other, like Chromecasts, they all use multicasts and MDNS and all that kind of stuff. If you are the type of person that segments your networks using VLANs as well, you might have run into this issue where MDNS doesn't traverse VLANs without some kind of shenanigans as well. So that might be a good way to experiment with some of these forwarders that Jay was talking about, or kind of like MDNS, like I don't know, proxy applications. The short answer in Tailscale land, at least, is that it won't work. So there's your answer. All right, so we've had a few Tailscale on Docker questions come through on the YouTube side. So I'm going to kind of tackle them just all in a row, and we'll have sort of 5-10 minutes on Docker here, probably.
Yeah, I'm glad you're on the call because this is really your wheelhouse more than mine.
I do love a good container, it must be said. So AI for All wrote in right at the beginning of the YouTube stream. I haven't been ignoring you. I've been saving you up as a batch for the end. I have Nextcloud all-in-one in Proxmox on Tailscale using a Docker compose.yaml. And I always find the Apache container to be unhealthy because the DNF resolver is causing problems on Tailscale. So I suspect that's down to resolve.conf getting overwritten at some point when you bring up your tailnet nodes. One of the ways you can solve that is to literally provide the DNS stanza as part of your Docker Compose YAML file, and sort of hard code it for that container's view of the world if you want to. Do you know any other ways around sort of resolve.conf issues, Jay?
What I've I hesitate to recommend this, but what I have done in the past when I really want something to stop trying to do what it thinks is in my best interest and just do what I tell it to is using Chatter, which is like chmod, but root only. And you can set a file as immutable with Chatter. And so chatter-i resolve.conf, once
Like
I've got
change
that set,
attribute, is that?
yeah,
Yeah.
basically means no other application is going to be able to override that. And it is not the graceful way of making this work, but it is that big hammer of I don't want to muck about with this anymore. I need this to work right now because I've got other actual work to do. So I'll come back and figure this out later, which we all know means never. So
Nothing more
it does
permanent than a
exist in my
temporary
lab.
solution, right? Especially when it comes to networking.
Mhm. But generally speaking, I try, especially if it's not my machine, I'll try and figure out what's clobbering the DNS and see if I can configure it not to.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. So the next question is from Adam Lepp. This is at the more recent end of the Docker side. Tailscale on Docker question: what's the best way to allow Docker containers to allow to access other Docker containers via Tailscale, regardless of their location and/or host? Every time I try, I seem to get inconsistent results.
So getting within the same Docker environment is that how you're interpreting this?
I think so, yeah. So I'm going to link you to a blog post I wrote for tailscale.com back in March, which is sort of like a deep dive, like everything I could have researched about Docker kind of thrown all into one blog post. And essentially what you're trying to do here is, let's say I'm going to contrive an example just for the sake of this explanation. Let's say you have a front end web app running in the cloud somewhere, but the database is running in your house, right? Between those two environments, there is a huge amount of network topology in the way that you don't want to care about because you're using Tailscale, right? So the idea would be that you want both of those containers to be unique entities, nodes on your tailnet. So the idea there would be you'd spin up what's called a sidecar container alongside each of the applications, both alongside the database and the front end. So you've got two containers in the cloud, one's a front end and a sidecar, and then what is Zoom doing? I need to turn off these reactions anyway. You've got your front end and your Tailscale proxy, and then in your house you've got your database, and yes, woo, you've got your database and your sidecar proxy as well. So what essentially happens is each of those four containers typically would have their own namespace within the Linux kernel on those two hosts. So when you do the sidecar thing, you actually do a network mode, service mode, where you merge them together. So you actually take the Linux kernel networking namespaces for those four containers and turn them into two kernel networking namespaces. So essentially what happens is the front end application becomes a node on your tailnet, but confusingly, it's the Tailscale container that becomes the node on your tailnet and kind of subsumes in the client front end web app. And the same thing happens with the database. Those two apps can now, theoretically at least, talk to each other via the two sidecars and then route the traffic around inside their own namespaces on their local nodes. Kind of butchered that explanation because I could have probably done without the balloons, to be honest. But if you want more information on it, I try to do a deep dive in the accompanying video to the blog post as well that came out in March, showing you how to use some of the Linux kernel tooling to kind of navigate around inside those Linux kernel namespaces, ns-enter being a perfect example of how you can show which ports are listening on which containers without actually running any tools inside the containers themselves. So I'm just going to say, go watch the video. And if you still have questions, you can reach out to myself or Jay, support at Tailscale, sales@tailscale.com, and we'll dive deeper if you need it.
Something else on that topic is you did a video recently on a community project called the TSD proxy. And my home lab Docker stuff, I'm moving over to that. It's a fantastic product around simplifying the networking around containers. And I've been really enjoying using that. Not that spinning up a sidecar is remarkably onerous, but this TSD proxy is just so easy to use, and I think it's a great use of this TSNet tool that we released.
Yeah, TSD proxy. There's a question actually in the YouTube chat I hadn't quite gotten to yet, so I'm glad you brought it up. AI for All wrote in the TSD proxy application you just made a video about. What is the IP address in there? Is that the host machine running the Docker or what? Yes. So you'll see in the YouTube video, it's a 10.42.30.37 IP address that's in there. That happens to be the CIDR of the subnet that I use to run all of my home lab stuff for Tailscale YouTube videos. So you want to put in there the Docker host IP address, and that should solve that problem for you. But for those of you that aren't familiar, TSD proxy it's a TS. What is TSNet, Jay?
It's actually a library that lets you build an application. It's natively in Go, so any Go application can use it to do Tailscale functions like join a tailnet or communicate over a tailnet. And it basically is Tailscale without the Tailscale binaries. Bring your own binary Tailscale.
You can embed you can embed Tailscale directly into your application. So in that example I contrived of the web app front end talking to a database, you could do without the sidecar because you've already got the Tailscale integration built directly into the application, for example. We see that quite a lot with people doing IoT stuff. So they've got huge deployments with thousands of nodes and they don't want to have sidecars, or they don't want to have, or maybe it's an embedded device that's super low power and can't run a specific version of the kernel that it needs to do the full user space implementation of Tailscale, but it can run Go. And so in that case, it can run the TSNet library and they'll just embed it directly into their application source code that way. But TSD proxy allows you to run a container alongside other self-hosted services and apply a label to those other services. And that's all you have to do to get them on your tailnet. It's kind of magic and kind of awesome. Caveat time, it's a community project. It's not a Tailscale official project. And I want to make that very clear that we don't officially support this project, but it's awesome. Jay and I both love it. All right. Bertrand writes in over on the Zoom side, what's on the roadmap for future videos? Oh, great question. I'm still working off my Thanksgiving turkey, if I'm honest. I hadn't quite gotten to thinking about future videos, but I'll tell you a few things I've got in my box of tricks next door that I'm kind of planning videos about at some point in the future. No commitment to when. One of them is an M4 Mac Mini as a self-hosted AI Llama LLM server of some description, maybe some N8N in there for some home self-hosted automation, who knows. And obviously Tailscale will be at the heart of allowing you to access that machine learning AI thing from anywhere you'd like. Another one is the Nano KVM, which is a tiny little, like it's like the size of a pack of like 10 quarters or something. It's tiny. I wish I had it on the table here. But essentially, it's a tiny little IP KVM device that runs Tailscale natively. So you could have an IP KVM device. I think it's about $30 or $40 for one of these things. It's amazing, and it runs Tailscale natively. So I thought I'd feature that on the channel too. I've got a video talking about some changes we are making or in the process of making to OAuth clients as well. Some of the scoping changes about how you generate those tokens is on the list. Bunch of stuff. Honestly, if you have requests, please reach out to me and I'll see what I can do. Well, we've still got a bunch of stuff over on the YouTube side. The YouTube chaps have vastly outpaced the Zoom chaps today. So thank you everybody who's written in so far. Avery wants to know when we're going to release Tailscale for ESP Home. I would love that too, because ESP Home added native WireGuard support not that long ago. So my assumption is that the hardware is capable. I don't know whether our implementation of it in Go is capable though. So it's trouble is with that as a request is it's not ever going to lead to any revenue to speak of. And, you know, it's like we've made a really cool product for home lab users already. And it's like, how much more awesome can it be? Well, it'd be pretty sweet if it was ESP Home. Awesome. But okay. I have a question. Is it possible to create an ephemeral token that will never expire?
So the token itself, no. What you would do if you want to have something locked in a secrets manager that can authorize ephemeral devices in perpetuity is you would use an OAuth client for that. And you would give it the scopes. And I have not studied the new OAuth scopes yet, but I believe there's an auth key scope, and you would give it the ability to spin up an auth key uh, and then you would use that OAuth client in a small script to generate a short-lived auth key as you need it and consume it immediately. And then that OAuth client can go back into the secrets manager and be locked away and safe. The OAuth clients themselves do not expire. The keys that they generate do. And how I tend to use them is that the keys that are generated by an OAuth client, I keep those very short-lived because they may be flying around in a GitOps or in some other less protected part of my network than I normally keep my secrets locked up in.
You can generate auth keys using a Go library as well. I think is it called get auth key or something? Oh, go get auth key, something like that. Anyway, in the Tailscale clients or something. There's a repo somewhere if I can find it in time. I will. In fact, I found it on Go packages. There we go. I'll paste it in the YouTube chat.
It's a proof of concept that basically uses an auth key to hit our API and grab or generate an auth key like that. I do the same thing with a bash script myself.
Yes. Now, history history writes in, hey, best tool team, can we ever dream of a GUI for ACLs for civilians like me?
I think there are a lot of people dreaming of that, and some of those people are on our design team.
Yes.
This is something that comes up a fair bit. There's sort of the home lab users that love to muck about with JSON. They exist. And then there's the very large companies that have automated tooling. They're already doing everything in Terraform or whatnot, Pulumi, these tools, and they love having the JSON. And in between those two extremes is a lot of people who would just love to be able to click through and make assignments. And we've started making some progress in that direction. If you look at our app connectors, we have a GUI to set up an app connector. What that GUI does is generates a stanza and drops it into your ACL for you. And I expect more tooling like that to come out in the future. I don't have any concrete timeline sort of things that I can promise today, but it is definitely on our radar, and it's definitely something that comes up at our weekly product meetings whenever somebody new asks about it.
Yeah, the absolute best way to get that kind of feature into Tailscale is be on to be wanting to buy Tailscale,
Mhm.
right, for your company and say, I won't buy it unless you do X. So that's all you need to do.
Mhm. Certainly gets
We
my boss's attention. Yeah.
exactly. Do we have any kind of like a feature requests or like a feedback email address that you know of, Jay?
The best way to do it really is in GitHub issues. There is an
Mm,
option when you're putting a GitHub issue, one of the drop downs is a feature request. And the nice thing about the GitHub issues is, yes, our product team sees that, but our engineering team lives in GitHub. So they are often the ones who will see that and surface it to product and be like, hey, we had this request come in and I thought about it, and maybe it's not going to be too hard. Maybe if I can have a few days, I can knock this out. And, not that things regularly bypass the product team's timelines, but every now and then a little quality of life improvement can sneak through.
right. We're into the last 5 minutes here, so this might be the last question. I don't know. Do you have any idea about whether Tailscale will run on a MIPS CPU,
I
such as
think
an edge
so.
router?
Uh, yes. Let me confirm that before I say, but if you look at packages.tailscale.com, yes, we do have static binaries for MIPS. Uh, I
Great.
I think that's how I got it running on my Kobo. Uh,
What's a Kobo?
it's like a Kindle, but a different brand, an e-reader.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Yep, yep.
and you're able to route them, and I was able to get Tailscale running natively on the Kobo so that I could talk to my Caliber server, which I've got running in Docker on my home lab.
What other self-hosted applications do you use? You've got Calibre, you've got
Yeah, I've got Jellyfin, of course. I've got the what's that PDF package? Sterling PDF
Mhm.
is really useful. Uh, just spun up searching after your last video, or searching, uh, however you'd like to pronounce that.
Somebody
Uh,
wrote in to tell me that the X is actually a Greek character and pronounced chi, so
okay.
searching makes a ton of sense now.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I've got a number of sort of Tailscale specific stuff in my home lab. So I've got a stack of VMs running over here, as well as various single board computers and whatnot. And every now and then I'll move one of my self-hosted applications onto those just because, I'm powering them up and testing things. They might as well do something useful.
What do you run this on? Is it like a stack of Raspberry Pis or what?
So my main machine that I'm talking to you on right now is just a great big Linux machine. I've got 32 cores and 64 gigs of RAM and a stack of I don't know. I don't even know how many hard drives I've got in here right now, but sufficient.
There's probably room for one more.
Yeah. And then, my stack of Raspberry Pis, I've got a banana Pi and a orange Pi. You know, it's a veritable pastry shop in here.
Love it. Okay, so a couple of just follow-ups before we close out today's session. History writes in, I would love a way for you to provide me to give you some money. Basically, let us pay you a tenner per year for the free tier so we can have some extra privileges. Well, we actually just added fairly recently the personal pro tier for users just like you. You'll get some extra users and some extra devices for, I think it's $5 a month or something like that. You are not alone in wanting to give us some money, which is quite a wonderful problem to have. We give a very generous free tier as it is, with 3 users and 100 devices for free at tailscale.com. But we heard from a lot of people that want to do small family deployments and or just want to give Tailscale some money to make sure it sticks around, really. And so we launched the personal plus tier, which has up to 6 users and a lot more devices to boot. So if that's you, history, it sounds like it might be you. That might be the plan for you. And then finally, Justin Ware wrote in, can we request multi-link bandwidth bonding on both clients and exit nodes?
You may request that.
You could ask.
Yeah.
So the answer to that question, Justin, I think is going to be the GitHub issue link that I've put in the chat for you just there. If that's something that's super important to you, post it over on our GitHub and we will absolutely take a look. Now, before we get out of here, Jay, is there anything you'd like to wrap up, some closing thoughts, or anywhere people can find you on like social media or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, if you look for me on social media, I'm there. I don't only talk about Tailscale on there. There's also, mostly my dinner and cats, I think. But a couple of things I wanted to mention as we're going into overtime here is a couple of features that just shipped out recently that I'm really excited about is if you're using device postures in Tailscale, we can now do country of origin as a device posture, either as an include or an exclude. So you can say, Alex can SSH into this production server only from the United States or Canada, or only if he's not in Canada, that sort of thing, which is, I think, giving a lot more flexibility into managing your own device postures. And for our probably mostly our enterprise customers, we have network flow log streaming to S3 now, which gives you a lot of flexibility for seams that we don't support natively yet. Most large seams will ingest from S3, so this is a bit of a Swiss Army knife tool that just got launched that is getting a lot of traction right out the gate.
Indeed. Those are some really cool features too. And those things only come because fine folks like yourselves ask for them. So I know we've been a little bit jokey about like the GitHub issues and stuff like that in here as being the best way to ask for things. But if you don't ask for it, you don't get. So it really is the best thing to do. So thank you all very much for tuning in. I suspect the next one of these will be after the holiday, Christmas, various religious festival break around New Year's. So until next time, I want to say thank you very much for everybody who's joined us. Keep an eye out for the next session, probably the first week or two of January, something like that. I've been Alex.
I've been Jay.
And thank you very much. See you next time.
Bye.